In this video I'm going to show you how to shorten a pair of trousers by hand. There's lots of alterations and repairs that can be done, and people often think you need a sewing machine to do them, but in this video I'm going to show you specifically how to do this by hand and what you're going to need, so you can really do this with very minimal equipment. So let's start with the equipment that you will need. So to start with, you will need a pair of scissors. So if you need to shorten your trousers so much that you're going to need to cut the fabric, you will need a sharper pair of scissors that will actually cut fabric. But if you can shorten them, if you're not shortening them too much, you won't need to cut the fabric, and therefore you can just use any scissors really that will cut thread. So ideally, if you've got some quite sharp scissors, then that's great, but alternatively you could use a pair of nail scissors or kitchen scissors, anything that will cut thread. And then you will need some thread. So thread is pretty readily available everywhere these days. You can buy it in supermarkets. All you're looking for is a nice regular polyester sewing thread, nothing too fancy. You can buy lots of different colours, you can buy lots of different qualities, but as long as it's 100% polyester and a reasonable quality, then you can do most repairs with that. You'll also need some needles. Again, a pack of needles. These are called household needles, so they've got a variety of different sizes of needles, and they've also got different sizes of eye of the needle. But I would recommend going for something that's quite small and sharp, and people tend to go for a bigger needle with a bigger eye, thinking it's going to be easier to thread. But if the weight of the needle's too thick or blunt, then you'll just have lots of problems sewing into the fabric. So look out for just regular sewing needles, but with a sharp point, and they generally have a fairly small eye if they're quite sharp. These are also useful, but not 100% necessarily. You can, some pins, this is really helpful, it will make life a lot easier, but you could substitute this with safety pins if you haven't got normal dressmaking pins. And then lastly, a tape measure is a useful thing to have, but again, if you haven't got a tape measure, you could use a ruler, or you could even mark some measurements onto a piece of card and use that as a template to kind of get your measurements right. So that's what you're going to need. So now let's take a look at how to shorten your trousers. So the first thing to do is to decide how much you want to shorten your trousers by. So what I'd recommend is, if you're doing this on your own, stand in front of a mirror and just put a few pins. They won't be necessarily even, but you can just pin them up where you think they look about right. And then when you take them off, this is where a tape measure is really helpful, or a ruler. You can measure round and see how much you've turned them up by. So at this point I've turned them up 4 centimetres. At this point it's 4.5 centimetres. And then when I get to the back, it's nearer 5 centimetres at the back. And it doesn't matter whether you or your friend is helping you. It can be quite difficult when they're on your body to try and get that accurate. So what I do now is sort of take an average. So say 4.5 centimetres is our average in this case. I'm just going to re-pin them and try them on again. So let's see what 4.5 centimetres accurately looks like. So I'm going to pin, just measure from the fold line to where the edge is, 4.5 centimetres. And again, you know, you could do this with safety pins, or you could also use the needles in your pack. If you bought a pack of needles, they would hold the hem in position. So we just go round and make that a little bit more accurate. That's all around about 4.5 centimetres now. So I could now go and try these on again and just see how that hem looks, and if I feel like it's a bit too short I could let that down and just keep going until you're happy with the measurement that you've got there. So it might be that actually now that they're even and equal all the way around, that they're just too long, so you have to go back and take them up a couple more centimetres and try them on again. So all we need to know is how much we ultimately want to turn up. So I'm going to say that we're going to do 4 centimetres on these trousers. So now that I know that we want to reduce the length by 4 centimetres, I can take all the pins out and we can start working on that. So we want 4 centimetres off the length of these trousers. So now that we've decided how much we want to cut off or shorten them by, let's turn the trousers to the inside and have a look at the hem. So the first thing I want to have a look at is how is the hem made. We really want to try and replicate what's already there. So this one's a great one for hand stitching, because it's a stitch that's made to look like hand stitching, even though it's actually sewn by machine. It's a blind stitch machine, so it's designed so that you can't see the stitches on the front. So we really want to try and replicate the hem. We don't have a sewing machine in this instance, so we're going to do the best we can with no sewing machine. So we want to create a hem like this. So let's just have a look at how much they've turned up. So they have turned up 3 centimetres, and we want to reduce our entire length by 4 centimetres. So actually we haven't got a lot to cut off, because when we've turned up 4 centimetres, we've really just got this existing hem that we want to remove, because we want to turn up and have a 3 centimetre hem, and then we're going to need about 1 centimetre to turn in. So actually we want to cut the fabric at where this existing hem folds. So if your hem is a lot deeper that you want to remove, it might mean that you can cut all of this hem off. But in this case we're going to need to unpick what's already there, because we want to cut on the line, but we don't want to cut the outside of the fabric. So let's start by unpicking this stitching. Because it's a sort of blind hem, it's going to have large stitches, so we can quite easily get into those stitches and just snip those with your scissors. You can see that comes away quite readily. Just be very careful not to cut the actual fabric when you cut the scissors. There is a tool called a seam ripper or a quick unpick, which is another really useful tool to have, but in this instance I'm trying to show you how to do this with minimal equipment. So this would be your nail scissors, or just the smallest pair of scissors you can get really if you need to unpick. Right, there we go. So we've let down that original hem. So from this point where the hem was, we want that to be 3 centimetres above. So, but like I said, I want to leave on an extra centimetre so that we can turn this and neaten the raw edge. So it means that I can actually cut along this crease line. If I didn't have a crease line to follow, I could measure and either measure and cut as I go, or put some pins or even maybe a pencil mark just to draw a line where I'm going to cut, so that I keep it nice and even, because keeping this accurate is going to be your neatest job really. But in this case I've just been really lucky that I've got this crease line, so I'm literally going to go ahead and cut along. I'm going to cut into that, and I'm going to cut the crease line. Again, this would be where you really need some fairly sharp scissors to do this, ideally. But you can see these are quite small, you know, nail scissors are pretty sharp quite often, so they may well work. But if you have to shorten trousers regularly, it's really worth investing in a little bit of kit to do this. So from this point now, we've got 4 centimetres that we want to turn up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and use an iron to turn and press 4 centimetres, and while I'm there I'm going to turn back a centimetre so that we've got a new folded hem. In an ideal world we'd have an overlocker, which means we could just overlock this raw edge, but we don't have that equipment, so the next best thing is just to turn in this raw edge. So an iron is a useful tool in this case, because ironing and pressing just sets all your seams, sets the fabric and makes it all look really neat. So when I've done that I'll show you how this looks, and you'll see the difference between this sort of loosely folded hem edge to when it's pressed by using an iron. So here's my pressed edge. So I've used the iron and I've measured, let's just undo this to show you. So I've measured a centimetre and folded that in and just ironed round. So as I go round I've just kept measuring a centimetre, and then I've turned the whole thing up and I've measured 3 centimetres. So that gives us our finish that we were looking for. We wanted a 3 centimetre hem like the original, but we haven't got an overlocker in this case, so we can't get this finish on the edge. So we've just done that double turned hem, and then I put a few pins in to keep that in place while I sew it. Again, you could use the needles, you could use safety pins. You just really want to try and keep that in place while you sew it. So the next process is to hand sew this. So I'm going to take a length of thread. I'm using a contrast colour, but obviously you'd use a colour that's as close as you can get to the garment, and that way the stitches blend in. But just so that you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to use contrast thread. So we want a length of thread that's roughly the length of your arm. By the time you put it through the needle, it's sort of just slightly longer than your elbow, and that's about a manageable length of thread. So let's grab our needle. Thread that. If you struggle threading needles, you can get needle threaders. They're quite inexpensive and easy to get hold of, can be quite useful. I'm going to use a single thickness of thread. We don't want it too heavy for this. So I'm going to start by just stitching into the seam just to secure the thread. You can do a little knot at the end, some people like to do that. I prefer just to do a couple of stitches on top of each other just to secure the thread, and when that's nice and secure, we're ready to start sewing. So I'm actually going to go upside down on this because I feel like it flows a bit better. So this stitch I'm going to do to hold this down is called herringbone stitch. It's not the only stitch that you can use for this, but I think this is probably easier and the most effective. It looks nice on the outside, it gives us the effect we want, and it works really well. So I'm going to start by stitching with the needle going to my left. I'm going to stitch a tiny stitch into the actual hem. I'm just going to take that pin out, and and I'm just doing, it's around about 2 or 3 millimeters, that stitch length, and I'm taking that to the left, and I want that tucked under, and then I'm going to bring the thread and the needle to the right, and I'm going to do another stitch, but this time into the trouser leg, not the hem. So I'm going to do a tiny stitch, and this time I want to only catch the threads in the actual fabric, so I don't want the needle to actually come through to the front. I just want to pull up a couple of threads from the fabric and then just take the needle up into the fabric like that. And this time I don't want to be tightening the stitch. I don't want to really pull it, because if you do that you'll start to get a kind of line, a ridge on the outside. So I'm just softly pulling that up, and this has got a tendency to come uncurled there, but I'm going to go, it'll start to sort of secure down. So then I'm going back into the hem, and that in the hem I can go all the way through the hem. Again, I'm not coming through to the front, but I'm just going all the way into the actual piece that we're turning up, the hem. So I'm taking the needle to my left and then back and across in front of that stitch. So we're kind of doing like a little, it's a herringbone design, so I'm going to do a few so that you can see how this looks. And then I'll take it back and then pull up just a tiny little stitch in the trouser. So my whole stitch length is probably just over a centimetre here, and I go into the hem to the left and then back to the right, crossing over that stitch and then forming another stitch into the trouser leg. Again, this will be something you get a bit of rhythm with after you've done a few stitches. Oops. So going into the trouser leg, just a few threads, taking it back to the right across that stitch, into the hem to the left, and then back across the stitch and into the trouser leg. So we're going onto the hem, onto the trouser leg each time, and the stitch is crossing over every single time. So I don't know if you can see that, kind of getting this cross over, but on the outside we're not seeing any stitches. It's soft, so it looks just like the original. So we're going to keep going like that till we've gone all the way round. Sometimes you want to uncurl. It goes quite quickly, this, because actually your stitches are fairly big. But again, keeping it really soft. So I'm going into the trouser leg, across the stitch and back into the hem, left to right, into the trouser leg, just a couple of stitches, keeping it soft. And then we've got to a pin, so take that out. So you know, this is where, because this fabric's quite bouncy, it's kind of got quite a lot of body to it. It's harder to hold down, so it depends on the fabric that you're working with as to how easy this will be, but it's quite a thick fabric, this, so it's actually working quite nicely. This kind of thing works better on a slightly heavier fabric, and you'll often find most tailored trousers will always have an invisible looking hem. So it's just a sort of tailoring method. That's getting wrapped around there. And just softly, just so that holds in place, and I'm back into the trouser leg from right to left, crossing over, from right to left in the hem, crossing back over. And you might have to kind of keep readjusting the hem if it is moving. Just keep an eye on how it's looking. And now we're already halfway round. Turn to the trouser, back across. So the thread goes, let's just have a look at that, because the thread goes underneath as you form the stitch. So your thread's down here, and then I'm making the stitch above it, so the thread is always underneath, and then we go across so that it makes that little cross, plucking up a couple of stitches, not pulling too tight, and then going across that stitch. But this thread is underneath the needle when you make the stitch. So a couple of stitches, bring the thread underneath the needle, and back. So left to right, across the stitch, left to right. This time the thread is still underneath the needle, that's it. And we're nearly all the way round. Let's just untwist that. You might need to keep moving it around to make it not twist. Thread underneath. And then once you're all the way around, if you need to, if your thread's not long enough, you can just fasten off like you did at the fasten on and off like you did at the beginning. So I'm just fastening off now because I have got all the way around, so I'm just doing a few stitches over and over on top of each other just to make that nice and secure. So if this was not all the way around but your thread's getting too small to handle, just do this at that point when you feel like you're not being able to manage the thread and start a new one on. It's fine to do that, but this has actually lasted all the way around because it's quite a narrow hem. So I can just fasten that off like that, and there's our finished hem. So let's turn that through to the front side and see how that looks. Let's have a look at that. So there we go. Even though I've stitched that with red thread, you can't see any stitches on the outside. And let's compare that to how it looked on the other leg, original stitching. So you can see we've basically got the same look, and we've stitched that by hand. So the softness of the stitching is the trick that keeps that kind of from having a ridge or having a line or anything showing on this part here, and just it's key to not let the stitches come through right the way through the fabric. But once we give that another little press on the edge there, that will look just as nice as the original, I think. So here's our finished pressed edge. When you press something, just use the steam in the iron. If you've got a fabric that's likely to go a bit shiny, you know, kind of polyester based fabric, you might want to put a cloth, a damp cloth, or just a dry cloth even would be better than nothing, just onto the hem. But all I really wanted to do was press this edge. I didn't want to form a ridge here, so I've only pressed it on the edge, just using a bit of steam and just pressing that edge down, so we've got a similar look. So yeah, there we go, finished shortened trousers. So I hope you enjoyed that video. This is a series of a few videos focusing on how to do some basic alterations and repairs by hand, specifically by hand. So look out for shortening your jeans, sewing on a button, and mending a hole in a seam. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.